we have taken numerous special topics that we have here at the museum and have done special issues. And one of them is on education in Rochester, where we talk about the various one-room schoolhouses. And we have this remarkable story, and that's what Cathy's going to talk about today, is where they've taken all these schools, and at some point, like they did throughout the country, where they went from one-room school districts to consolidated schools. So tonight it gives me a chance to introduce Cathy Fitzpatrick. Cathy is our education and volunteer coordinator here at the museum. She handles all of our programs. We have 2 or 3 classes here every single day. So it's except this week. This is spring break, so it's for us. It was a great timing, so she could finish this program tonight. So it gives us a chance to this program because it forces us to go back through our archives again and really re-verify all the information that we think we know and make sure we have sources behind it. And she's interrupted me about 40 times this week with saying, hey, there's one more nugget. Did you know this? And she rattles off a new fact that we've learned that we thought we knew, but maybe it wasn't all there. But with that, let's give a warm welcome to Cathy Fitzpatrick.
All right. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Got my lapel on. All right, so thank you, Pat, for the wonderful welcome. My name's Cathy Fitzpatrick, and I'm going to be introducing you. I shouldn't say introducing you, but talking about one-room schoolhouses, because as people were walking in, I heard some stories and saw some photos. So I'd like to start off today just by asking everyone in the audience, can you raise your hand if you actually attended a one-room schoolhouse? Okay, yeah. Believe it or not, I say believe it or not for me because I found it kind of crazy to think that in the 1950s, kids were still going to one-room schoolhouses. So I had a lot of my own personal aha moments throughout the program here. But as we do go along, if those of you who have been here would like to say something, yeah?
Yeah, I went to one through the 8th grade. It took me 9 years.
Well, that's... Yeah. 1965, I believe, was the last year that a one-room schoolhouse could operate in the United States. So that was 1 year before they shut down one-room schoolhouses altogether. So, yeah. All right. So I am going to start with an overview of how, depending on how you count them, 11 to 15 school districts here in Avon Township turned into one Greater Rochester Consolidated School here. In general, too, I kind of want to talk about those national trends. One-room schoolhouses are not just a Michigan, just an Avon thing. This is a national thing. But how do these trends apply to where we are living right here in Rochester, Michigan? So with that, let's take a look at some of the first schools here in Avon Township. Disclaimer, I hate superlatives. The word first, everyone has a claim to the word first. So I actually have 6 or 7 first schools that could all be contenders for Avon Township here. On record, we do have 7 schools, but as you can see, if you read through some of these, the information is a little sketchy on a couple of them. So it starts off in 1821, the Graham family. They were some of the first settlers, European settlers, to come to Rochester in 1817. So it only makes sense that in 1821 that their house and farm would become one of the first schools here in Avon Township. Right around that time, you also have George Postal, which is over here off of the Clinton River, this star, who also had a school. But if you notice, the teacher was an old man, halfway doctor, and his name now forgotten. So I'm going to guess they didn't like him too much. And they critiqued him, too, that he owned no property and was hired probably to give him a chance to earn a living for at least a short time. You continue along, it talks about how in 1824 on the Burbank farm, there was actually a log shanty, so referring to the types of structures, so it was separate from a traditional home. Of course, we have 1825, the Stony Creek Schoolhouse right here in Avon Township, right down the street from us, which will be a lot of the focus. And then you start getting the ones in downtown Rochester too. So in 1828, at the northwest corner of Walnut and 3rd, that's one of the first Rochester schools, District number 5. That one becomes important because everyone kind of consolidates into District number 5. So the neat thing about all the first schools in Michigan is they were actually before Michigan law telling you had to have schools. So people wanted to educate their children. They took time out of their extremely busy schedules to do it. Over here, this is the Graham family. This is the house that sits on that property, but it no longer sits there. Actually, this little stone under a tree marks where the house used to sit. So down the street, you can kind of see the fire department. This is where the farmer's market sits. So up this way is Home Bakery there. So next time you're downtown, check it out. That's where the Graham family schoolhouse used to sit. And then over here, I do have the first high school, 1845, which is after the common school legislation we'll talk about. But I wanted to put it on here as before legislation because it came before graded schools were created in legislation, which came about 10 years later. We have a whole presentation on the Rochester Administration Building as we know it today that has now moved out, but this was the high school, previously Avon Lyceum, and previously a private school ran by a man, I think, named John in downtown Rochester there. So here's a map to kind of give you a general overview of what this area became. I apologize, it is an old newspaper, but I figured they marked it up better than I could. So you can see all these names out here are the one-room schoolhouses or fractional school districts, and then this wonky outline is what became Rochester Community Schools. I say wonky because the townships are squares. So actually you can see right down here a rectangle of Avon Township. That's where you get the number 11 or 15. It depends on if you're counting townships that are fractional or Oakland Township or Waterford Township as well, so, or Washington. So. And I think someone said that they went to Klein's school. Yeah, right up front. So. All right, so we're going to roll it back to the beginning. Not quite to the glacier age of Michigan. Not quite back to Pontiac's War and the Native Americans and French fur trade that was here. But we're going to roll it back to the political beginnings of Michigan in 1837. So when this place became a state, that's when schools became a legal requirement in the area. So this over here is a gentleman named John David Pierce. And do we have any educators or retired educators in the crowd? Okay. The name Horace Mann probably is familiar to you. He's the father of modern education. He was the father of the Common Schools movement. And this gentleman, John David Pierce, was said to be doing some of the same work that Horace Mann was doing in Massachusetts. He was doing right here in Michigan. Funny enough, he actually didn't get to go to school. He had to teach himself. His dad died at a very young age, and so the family didn't have any money to send him to school. You used to have to pay per day, per child, to go to school on top of your taxes. It was called the rate bill. So he actually educated himself enough to go to Brown University, to a state seminary school. He became a missionary, and that's actually why he moved here to Michigan, as a missionary originally. But he was on the state constitution legislation for the Constitution in 1850. And he was the first state public superintendent of public education. So this man right here proposed in the 1830s things that didn't even get instituted until the 1900s. He had all these great ideas, such as minimum wages for teachers, free schooling, so you don't have to pay a rate bill to go to school. He wanted to do graded schools instead of one-room schools. And all of these reforms that he put forth got slashed down. And then when he was retired on his farm in Ypsilanti, he's probably sitting back saying, I told you so. But this is some of the things we'll go over with the public legislation. Who has to comply? Who's going to teach these classes? What did they look like? And who's managing them? And finally, who cares? Like Pat said, everybody. Everybody has an opinion, and everyone's very vocal about the public schools here in Avon Township, which is a good thing, I think. So first, you have to create the schools. In 1827 was the first legislation that started to organize districts. So you didn't have to be a full township, you were actually neighborhoods. Think of it as a neighborhood was your school district to start. And anyone with more than 50 kids or families was supposed to have a school. It was not enforced because we weren't a state yet. They couldn't enforce it. In 1829 is when they started to regulate their schools. They said, okay, we made them, but now we have to figure out how to run them and run them properly and run them well. So they actually started creating a board of directors. 1837 is the year that Michigan became a state. This is the law that John David Pierce worked on, and it's the primary school law. It pretty much sets up how schools are going to run all the way up to almost the 1880s. For 50 years, it follows this rule. The board of directors is something that becomes very important because that's one of the reasons people don't want to consolidate. They want the local control and local power. The director, the treasurer, and the moderator who runs the meetings, they are your neighbors. They are that small community. They have all the power at this time, all the way up until they consolidate. They can decide who to hire, who to fire, what they want their building to look like. The regulation just isn't there like we have regulation today. In 1838, it was reported there were already 1,020 school districts and 28,764 students. And then over here, these are just some pictures of local schools that we have, or had, I should say. Big step, consolidation. So these next legislations that you see on the screen are actually ones that set up from going to the rural one-room schoolhouse into a graded school district. So these are the laws that started laying that foundation to create more consistency and more standardization across not only the county, but the entire state of Michigan. We weren't special in this. We were actually copying everything that was going off the East Coast. So when they're saying in 1870 and 1917, we think these ideas are good, they're like, hey, we followed Massachusetts in the 1850s to design this, and you thought it was good. This is what Massachusetts is doing now. Let's follow this as well. So you have in 1859, this is where you can actually have graded high schools. So the Rochester High School was founded in 1845. And 59 was that first legislation. 1873 is the big one right here. This talks about how everybody has to vote and agree to be consolidated. So everybody in the locality has to agree to be consolidated. And finally, in 1917, Rural Agricultural School Act. Basically, if you didn't want to join the city, that's fine. You can be a rural school. You don't have to have the same standards as the city schools, but there's a different set of curriculum that you're going to teach as a rural school, and home ec, wood shop, things like that were included. It was considered a 3rd or 4th grade school in a standard, not necessarily like a first grader. It was a sub-level school. So, how were all these schools funded? Funding is a hot topic issue at all times, but the main sources for funding was the rate bill. This was abolished in 1869 when free schools were created. But the rate bill basically said you have to pay $3 per child, $4 per child. And that was voted on by the board of directors. So that was chosen by the neighborhood. The primary fund is state money. And that was from the Land Ordinance of 1787, early legislation in the territorial era. And basically it said, for section 16 of your township, it's for schools. And Michigan petitioned that, well, we don't want to put our school on section 16. We want to sell that land, use that money to fund the schools. And that's what they did. You had township taxes, and then you had penal fines. This is what I found a little interesting. You could get money from the state if you spent $10 a year on library books. You would get extra money. So basically they're saying, buy books, we will pay for them, but the money has to go towards books. So I did put on here a treasurer's book of accounts. So up here, this is one of our earlier records from, I believe, oh, the year isn't even on this one, I apologize. But down here, if the handwriting's hard for you to read, this is just a transcription from an annual report showing those different types of taxes, the mill tax voted, and then very often you also see a tax on dogs. I didn't know dog taxes went that far back. So. All right. Who regulates the funds? Who gets to decide how the money is spent? That goes back to that board of directors. You have the director, the assessor, and the moderator. What do they do every year? Every year in September, they actually get together and they have their annual meeting. And so they do things, they elect each other as officers. They can hire a school teacher. They set the number of months they're going to attend and the rate that they're going to charge per child each year. And then, of course, if they want to do any maintenance or upkeep on the one-room schoolhouse. I do say the board runs the meeting. Anyone in the community is allowed to come. And this is kind of the downfall of rural schools, too. If you don't have someone who's willing to take on these roles, and if you don't have active community members who want to share an opinion and care, this is going to fall flat on its face, and you're going to have a shanty in your backyard. But maybe then again, I guess you don't care. So, down over here, you can see this is actually from the Stony Creek Schoolhouse, fractional number 1. And it's just a sample of an annual meeting. So it says it was motioned that the district officers be elected. They voted for winter school for 5 months to be taught by a man teacher. Voted that public monies be appropriated for winter. So they're gonna tax people. Motioned and seconded that we have a summer school for 5 months to be taught by a woman teacher. That failed though. They rescinded the vote to have 3 months instead. So, and then at the very end, they're going to authorize the board to hire any other man teacher as they see fit for the expiration of winter school. So basically they're like, we don't want to have another meeting, we're going to authorize ourselves, thank you. And that's what is in this handwritten document. This is one of the challenges of researching one-room schoolhouses, and reading, writing, and arithmetic were very important. So let's talk about the teachers that they were choosing to hire and who were educating the kids here in Avon Township and across the country. Teacher certification did not actually come through until 1915. So there were legislative acts on who could hand out certificates to the teachers saying that you are qualified, but pretty much if your district board wants to certify and hire a teacher, they can, all the way up till almost 1891. In fact, in 1859 to 1867, they had a little bit of a fight. Township inspectors and county superintendents could offer a certificate and say, this person's great, go ahead and hire them. Right? But then they show that certificate saying they're approved to the local district, and they say, we're going to also evaluate you. That certificate means nothing here. So teachers were constantly under scrutiny back then and even today. So one of the trends throughout our education here. I just wanted to put this in. I found it interesting. Of good moral standing. Teachers had to be of good moral standing to be hired, which is very subjective. The biggest one, though, in the early times is that a female teacher could not be married. They're going to regulate where you go throughout the day. Can you date? Can you not date? After so many hours of school, are you going to go home and read the Bible? There's suggestions on how teachers should relax. And even up until, by 1872, teachers were no longer being boarded in the one-room schoolhouses. After the rape bill was abolished in 1869, teachers did not stay in homes. So that's when you get this set of rules, because if they're not in your house under your watchful eye, they could be out in the community wreaking havoc, right? So, all right. So let's take a look at the teachers of Stony Creek Fractional School number 1, which is right down the street from here.
What does fractional mean?
Oh, good question. Fractional means that it is between townships. So it crosses a township line, a political border, but the school district goes across. So there's a fractional, this is with Shelby, there's a fractional with Oakland, yeah. Oh, yeah, so they just crossed that border, and that's how you got that weird shape at the very beginning of all the consolidated schools, was those fractional districts, yeah. So you want to add something? Oh, okay. There were a lot of great quotes looking through the superintendent annual reports for the state of Michigan, but this one is, though one of the highest and noblest professions presents a most motley of assemblage, the woodman may wield alternately the axe and the ferule. So just kind of critiquing anybody can be a teacher in the 1850s to the 1900s. It gets worse, though. This was a critique in 1853 about the teachers. The young female may pass as a teacher those few intermediate years when mind is in the chrysalis state between the girl and the woman, and leave in the schoolroom her own careless, inaccurate habits, never to be eradicated. And the student of the incipient man, can't forget the boys, right? Whose financial resources are low, reluctantly dropping his books, would fain to betake himself as a temporary relief to teacher's vocation. So this superintendent thought that teachers were so bad that they were desperate for a job, and that was the only reason that they were teaching at that school. I think that's a little biased of an opinion, but very harsh critique. So how does this kind of national standard of national rules apply here at Stony Creek? These are teacher reports from the winter of 1885 and the spring of 1886. So up here you'll see William, that man, and I could not figure out her name. I'm going to call her Emma. It's E with a bunch of lines. So if you are good at transcribing things, let me know. We'll talk after this. But you can see down here that they list the aggregate numbers, which is very helpful because William Norton kept no records and Emma kept all the records. So the next slide is actually of Emma's handwritten notes. You can see all the student names over here to the left. You can see their ages. And then over here, their total attendance, their total absence, and all these little X's are when they actually showed up to school. So very, very detailed. I appreciate that, though. She had fewer students. She had about 10 to 15 less students on average compared to the winter. And the students changed. Most of the students were under the age of 13 in the springtime. And I say spring, but this is really spring into summer. The only 15-year-old boy that came was here in July and August. He wasn't here all May, June, because he was out in the fields planting. And then down here, this is Clark Price. I apologize that this is over here. But you can also see that he's an example of a kid. He came back in the fall, skipped the summer entirely, and then he came right back the next year. So he only attended winter school. When regulation happened, it was really only 3 months you had to attend. Summer school was optional. So Clark is an example of that happening. But when you look at the records, most of the kids here in Stony Creek came for both semesters, both winter and summer. It's just, they didn't come consistently. Not many came out here very consistent. I took it upon myself to dive deep. This is our bicentennial year of Stony Creek Village, and we're really trying to learn about the other families that were living here in the community. And the schoolhouse was a gem because all of the names that we didn't know, they were right here in the school book records. So this right here is the future of some of our research, all these names going through census data, trying to weave some more webs, more stories, more people that came out of the village here. But for tonight's presentation, I'd like you to look over here to the left. You see the winter and summer alternating, and then you also see men and women alternating. Notice the wage. Women did get about half of the wages of men. I particularly liked when they tried to make it look like more by saying 12 shillings a week. That does sound pretty good, but when you do the math, it is not at all. But you also see repeat names. So like James Price, who was very elusive in the census, you also see Maria Price. So it makes you start to wonder if that's father and daughter here in the community, growing up in the school and then becoming the school teacher here. When you look at the ages of all the teachers, they're usually around 20 to 24 years old. There are outliers here and there, especially Caroline Lawson here. She became a teacher at age 31. So there were a couple spinsters, as you might say, being teachers out here at the schoolhouse. This takes you to about 1889. By 1890, that was the end of winter-summer rotations. After that, they started going into our traditional school year. Being someone coming from an era where I don't face as much discrimination as a woman, I found this quote extremely interesting in that they called women teaching in the winter season an experiment. And this is the principle of the normal school, which became Eastern Michigan University, so the teacher training school. The woman in charge of the teacher training school goes through and tells the lady, may you as a female teachers cultivate justly and truly the responsibility which rests upon you. Upon your success in the profession you have chosen depends more than perhaps you at present realize. Basically saying, if you guys fail, that's the end. You know, we get one shot at this. But they do prevail. You do see that women teachers are the predominant teacher moving past the 1870s. So here's a chart of the school teachers from 1890 all the way up to the 1900s. And you can see that if you look over here to the side, it's all females now. And I found it very interesting, here in Stony Creek, you have a lot of repeat teachers. One of the biggest complaints by the superintendent of the state was inconsistency in teachers. That was one of the reasons they wanted graded schools. But Stony Creek here was kind of a shining example of what to do with your one-room schoolhouse. And this is Stony Creek over here, you can see them all. Since we talked about consolidation all the way up until the 1930s, I figured why not fill out the chart, take us all the way up until the last day of school in Stony Creek fractional number 1, which was in 1935. This is where you see that all the teachers were unmarried, and the pattern was as soon as you got married, that's when you quit school. So they had about 1 to 3 years on average, and then they'd go get married. Sometimes they would come back and serve kind of as an intermittent. So you get Carmen Pickering here. She pops up a couple times, and she's actually married at the end, and she leaves. But if you notice, if we go back, Lulu Pickering was on one of these slides as well. Where is she? You see, oh, right above Carmen, sorry, right here. Lulu, and this is her younger sister, Carmen. So passed down through the family recommendation for the school here. So down here at the very end, things get a little hazy in our records. The record books of Stony Creek Fractional Number 1 do not match up with the newspapers are reporting. So we kind of go with the checkbook as our documentation. Where was the money going? And so we have at the very end in 1931 to 1933, we have 2 married teachers from outside the district. Prior to that, everybody was local to Avon or Macomb County. In 1933, 1944, the district board actually tried to fire Miss Frankie here, and they had Miss Nina Boyd lined up, this is my theory, to teach in the fall. But Frankie presented herself at the annual meeting and said, no, I can do better. Just let me stay 1 more year. And she convinced them well enough that she would punish the children better. That was the complaint, the children were acting out. So she stayed 1 more year, and then Miss Nina Boyd came in and taught. And after that, they actually started busing the kids off to Rochester. So Stony Creek Fractional Number 1 remained as a legal school district with people like Sarah Van Hoosen Jones as the director or treasurer, but no one actually went to school in the one-room schoolhouse. They were shipped off to Rochester into their school system. We have records of them going to the Woodward School for a while. So there are a few exceptions, but in general, 1935 was one of the last times until the 50s that kids were in that school. So let's take a step back and talk about the schools and their designs and why everybody was starting to ship their kids off to the main schools instead of using their one-room schoolhouses. These are different buildings throughout Michigan. These are taken actually from this book on the table here, Michigan One-Room Schoolhouses. Mary actually presented here at one point. We have a poster of some of these schools. But if you notice, they're all very similar in style. The interiors were about 3 windows long, no windows in the back, teacher up front, desks throughout. And you'll see up here an addition on the front, an addition on the back, addition on the front. Those are also similar because they were actually handing out pretty much blueprints on how they wanted the schools to be built. So that's what we'll look at next here. But harsh word for teachers, harsh words for schoolhouses. I apologize. It's the district number 1 and number 2 have buildings fit in winter, only for the polar bear, walrus, reindeer, Russian sable, or Siberian bat. And the majority of their inhabitants seem to think the seasoning process necessary to the imaginary embryo statesman. That was an Allegheny Canny. So he's saying these people think their kids are gonna be great politicians, but they don't even have a house for animals. Which the same happens over here. The inspector report from 1862 says many schools are not fit for cowsheds or pig pens, which ought to be indicted as public nuisances, and in which, if the children were sent as a punishment, the entire community would cry out against its gross enormity and cruelty. So basically, sending them to those schools was a punishment in and of itself, and this is a superintendent saying that. So there were some very harsh critiques, but some of them were very warranted. Schools were outdated and falling apart because they were been using them for over 50 years without maintenance. This slide shows all the different styles of schoolhouses across the nation. So here, we're used to seeing a very particular schoolhouse, but I think when they're talking about these dilapidated schoolhouses, this is also in the back of their mind. So these are from across the nation. This one's in South Dakota. We've got Wyoming, Idaho, Kansas. You have tar paper, adobe. This is built into a hill. This one's a tent. And this one is literally just tree trunks with brush over the top of it, out in the middle of a field. Moral of the story, they were using what they had around them. So I think the Michigan schools were doing all right. These are just some statistics about what the schools looked like by 1877. So about 30 years into existence, what are these schools looking like at this time? Where are we? There were 5,700. 538 they list as unfit. I don't think that's too bad. 1,119 had outhouses that were unsuitable. 2,000 had suitable furniture. That's about half had good furniture. I don't think that's too bad. 3,000 had usable blackboards. 1,800 used the same textbooks. So the kids in the same school didn't even use the same books. So that would be very hard for the teacher to offer consistent learning for those schools. And if you look, even less followed a course of study. So a course of study is you're going to start with the Baldwin reader, then you're going to go to the arithmetic, and then the geography book. How are we going to follow that? That was non-existent. 2/3 did not have a dictionary, which was really big to the superintendent, being able to know how to spell. And you see that throughout, even up to the 1950s in the records. Everybody's name is spelled about 5 different ways. And if you do any genealogical histories, you know that you have to use search terms 3 different ways to find those other ones as well. And the last one is only half kept records. So they were doing their own business. It was local business. It was their business. It was nobody else's business. So they didn't bother to keep those records. So when you're looking back through old statistics of the annual reports, every single time they say, well, we have 12,000 districts, only 3,000 sent information, so this is what you're looking at. So if you're a numbers person, the annual reports are great to look at, but sometimes the numbers don't mean a whole lot when you're looking through them. So pictures are worth 1,000 words. So if these schools are so bad, how do we fix these one-room schoolhouses? They actually gave a fix in 1897 at the turn of the century. It's really simple. Remove the platform. So this is before, this is after. Up here is a platform that the teacher, it's a raised up about 2 to 4 inches. It would have the teacher's desk, and that's where she would actually teach from. You'd have the stove in the middle of the classroom, and then the students kind of around that, in this model here at least, and then the bookshelves as well. They want you to add ventilation, rearrange the desks, put the heat in the back because you're going to have vents throughout the school, and then you're going to put the teacher up front. And if you notice, they actually have seats 2 by 2 at this time period. So it was a double wide desk was very common in the early times. So if nothing else, add some windows, open the windows, and move your heater back. Those were kind of the main suggestions. But by 1915, they had, if you wanted to build a school for more than $300, so if you wanted to build a school, you had to have it approved, and it had to follow one of these new footprints. So the modern one-room schoolhouse would add in cloak closets, have a library, the hallway, a porch for fresh air. And then over here you can see a different option where all of that's in the front. So those photos of the one-room schoolhouses at the very beginning with an addition at the front or the back, that's what they're adding on. So this is the classroom. We're going to add a coat closet. We're going to add a teacher's room, a library room, a porch, some extra space for their stuff. The material of the schoolhouses also started to change. As you can see here, 13 counties south of the baseline. So they had to map out Michigan. This is the meridian, goes down all the way through Ohio. This is the baseline. So these 13 counties, which had 1/3 of the population, only had 36 log schoolhouses left. So as the population grew, it pushed them to renovate and rebuild all of these schoolhouses. The further north and west you go, the longer the old, dilapidated, repaired schoolhouses survive, as opposed to rebuilding it. And your options here in Michigan were log, frame, which is a plank from all the sawmills around here, brick, or stone. This is Stony Creek, so you can guess ours is stone, and there's actually plank on it as well. They didn't just tell you what the outside of your structure should look like, they also gave you suggestions on the interior and exterior furnishings. They really wanted to create that learning environment and that classroom management that we focus on today as teachers. Up here, this is actually from the Henry Ford, the McGuffey School in downtown Detroit, how they have theirs set up. Notice there's a fireplace instead of a stove. And that double wide seats in there. Over here, this is an example where you can see that outdated platform that the teacher would be on top of, so all the kids could see them. And you see some of the items that they suggest buying, a globe and maps and flags starting to show up as well. But I wanted to include this because there's wants and there's needs. So I teach first graders when they come out here about the natural resources of Michigan and what you need and what you want. And sometimes I think the superintendents, when they were telling them what to do about their one-room schoolhouses, got those a little mixed up. They actually told them that the windows should be provided with green shades. Yellow is not good for the eyes. Where they came up with that, I have no idea. But in the records of our schoolhouse here, they painted the desks green. So it must have stuck with them a little bit there. But they do talk about ambient light coming in, so they don't have to spend as much money on their lighting within the schools. And ventilation. Health of the students became very important at the turn of the 1900s. And they wanted that proper ventilation, and later on they even say, just open a window. Just open a window and let some air in. The school grounds, they also gave you some suggestions. These are pretty, I feel like these are good demands. Have a fence so kids don't get run over, I guess, by a horse in that time period. Some shade trees so they don't get sunburned. Grass is a good thing, right? You don't want to get too much muddy. Disease can spread in mud there. A walkway, maybe, and then a place to store your fuel. So when it comes to the school grounds, I don't think they had very high demands for those. Heating and ventilation, they talk about going for a wood furnace. It's the cheapest and best. And actually, in history, they found wood burns cleaner than coal. Coal stays longer, and you don't have to tend to it, but it's not as good for your health. They want you to put vents in and then hang your window cords with weights so that you can move them and they don't get caught on all of your bookshelves. They didn't waste a minute to say add some bookshelves and buy those books, those $10 worth of books, get those bought. Miscellaneously, they want you to have wardrobes. Don't put the entrance right across from the window. You don't want to get a full draft blowing the papers everywhere. And you can't make this stuff up. If necessary, stand over the builder with a club to make him put the blackboards low enough for the little people. So they were really paying attention to the details. Some things mattered and some things definitely did not matter. But I show you all of these things because when we look at the records of the Stony Creek Schoolhouse, they implemented all of this stuff 30 years before they were being told to implement it. 30 years before. Oh, and I had to put this one in as well. Brick is the best material for the outhouse. Deeply planted posts so it doesn't get knocked over in the wind. And a fresh, quality, fine sand in the paint, thus giving a surface so rough that it offers very poor opportunity for the obscene marking of the walls, as to cover up the vile language which the evil-minded delight to display in such places. So even in the 1800s, kids were still defiling public property. So All right, so how does this narrative that they are proposing in the 1890s, when you see all of this progress, all of this population boom, how does that apply here to Stony Creek Schoolhouse? Well, 1825, when it was originally built, if you visit the school today, it is not the 1825 school. So that's what I'm going to walk you through. How did we get to the building that we know and is on site today? First of all, I said it's all about the locals, right? This is the local district community asking for a special meeting because our school is not such as we want it to be. So they literally said, hey, you guys need to fix our school. Fix it. So they called that special meeting, and they decided that they were going to add an addition and move it to the north end of said schoolhouse. It was agreeable to vote in 1842. Motioned that all repairs would be done by the 15th day of November. That was so school could start. And that they were going to raise $100 to build the addition and repair the schoolhouse for winter school of 4 months. So these additions, we have no idea what they look like, even if they happened. We don't have receipts. We don't have the treasurer books. We just have this one meeting report saying they wanted to do it and they were going to do it. From there, it gets a little confusing. By 1846, there's a notice that there will be a school meeting on the 20th day of October at 6 o'clock in D.B. Taylor's Hotel for the purpose of hiring and fitting a suitable room for a winter school. So they just did all these repairs, but now they need to hire a teacher and rent out a room, and they're having their school meeting in the hotel instead of the school. So our best guess is that school must have burnt in some way or form. Something happened that they could not use that building anymore. Prior to 1846, though, they were already talking about building a whole new school. It's just something accelerated that, and we really don't know. That's lost to history why they decided to accelerate that there. But on the other side, we have a contract. They actually sent out a bid. Nathaniel Millard was, sorry, I don't have the transcription. Nathaniel Millard was the one who won the bid, and it was about $300 to build the school and some change. So this is how we knew the new school was coming. They had to decide where to put it. Again, we don't know what happened to the old school and the old school site. We assume that it was over here somewhere. But the new school, I don't know if you can see it. Can you find the word school on here? It's gonna be right there, right on the corner. So it's right on this section 25. That's where they placed the new school. If you notice, the Baptist church is right across the street. Very confusing. We have all the references. We have no archaeological evidence. We have no receipts, no books. We just have newspaper articles and mentions of the Baptist church. Otherwise, if we didn't have this map, we don't have any physical evidence of where that church used to be. But they put the school right on the corner. And if you notice, Jay Van Hoosen, Joshua Van Hoosen, he was on the board. The farmhouse is over here. And actually, all of the ladies walked down the alley and attended the 1825 school or the 1848 school over here. In 1866, they decided to renovate this school. So this is about 10, 15 years before those reports I showed you came out suggesting on what they should do. This is when they actually dug out a cellar. They removed it from the foundation. They redid all of the joists in the basement to the exact locations, heights, thicknesses. They wanted to lay new wood on the floor. 24 iron frame desks. If you notice, 4 is F-O-R-E, so someone didn't make it past 3rd grade there, or there wasn't a dictionary in the school. And they finished with 3 coats of paint, the frames to be black, the wood to be painted green. They did put a teacher's platform back in, so they hadn't fully rearranged that. They must have liked that as a local school district. It goes on to be talking about the chimney that they're going to put in, and they do put in ventilation. So in the schoolhouse, if you visit it today, there's a spot in the floor where it looks like the stove used to be, and now it's back on the wall. They put in a fence, right? Good suggestion. Everybody needs a fence. And I joked earlier that it was so the kids didn't get run over by horses. We put up fences today so kids don't get run over by cars. But really, at this time period, it was to keep any wandering animals out. So any pigs or cows, they didn't want them in the schoolyard there. And we find out that they had 2 outhouses. And they rearranged the outhouses out there. We only have a picture of 1 outhouse at the schoolhouse. And of course, it needs to be finished by the 15th day of May so that it's ready for summer school out there. So, what does this look like? This right here is the 1848 and then the 1866 addition onto the front. So 1848, and this was actually 1866. Prior that transcription, this right here, we didn't have this transcription. In fact, this document might not even exist anymore. The Daughters of the American Revolution came through and they transcribed all of the 1841 to 1860 documents that are housed at the Oakland County Pioneer Historical Society. Mouthful. But basically, they read all that hard handwriting for me, and they placed this in a nice document, and our archivist from 15, 20 years ago actually had a copy of this buried deep in our files. So this kind of floated to the top, luckily, for me. But before that, all we had were receipts from Dillman and Upton. And so, we kind of thought here at the museum that 1935 was the date because we have all of these construction receipts, but that was actually for roofing repairs. We found the director's report for that year, and there was a lot of repairs on the school as well. We also know that it was not added in 1935 because Sarah Van Hoosen Jones, as the director, writes, I guess I have to read this one, I didn't write in my transcription. The adjourned meeting was called to order on July 22nd, 1935 by the moderator. After some discussion, it was moved and seconded that the district would not install sanitary facilities in the school building. Carried. So the meeting before this, they voted they were going to add bathrooms. And then at this meeting, they said, no, we're not. But if you keep reading, it's because it was agreed upon that they're going to assemble and talk about closing the school and sending the pupils to the Rochester schools at another meeting. So between that transcription and this special meeting report, we know that there was never an operating bathroom inside the fractional schoolhouse 1 for its entire operation, which was remarkable. This continues on, this is the next meeting where they actually voted, and interestingly enough, they voted by money. Basically, they said it's cheaper to send your kids to another school than it is to maintain your own school. And they were proud enough and enjoyed the Rochester schools enough, respected them enough, that they just sent them off that way. So it says, the director, Mr. King, laid before the meeting a plea and some figures to show that all pupils could be transported to Rochester schools and tuition paid for the bus cost to operate the district school. And after a considerable debate, a vote was taken which resulted in an 18-8 choice to close the school. So here you have the director's annual report, 1935, and closing the school. Mr. O. Wallace came and cleaned it and closed it up. You start to see school bus is the main bill, and then they still cut the grass, and they still paid the light bill at the Stony Creek Schoolhouse for at least 4 more years of the records that we know. Here you'll also see, continuing along, driving the school bus, but the tuition was $160. So if you think about it, they were going to have to spend over $300 to build a school, keep repairing it, hire the teacher, or they could spend about $150 to send their kids somewhere else and not worry about it. And that's what they did. In 1948, though, the Rochester School District had too many schools just sending their kids over to them and not supporting them. You also had a huge population boom that was coming to town. So here we have District number 5 pop back up. This is downtown Rochester, District number 5 with the high school, graded schools. Not a one-room school at this point, it is graded school system. And one of the big pushes for consolidation was the fact that they were running out of space in downtown Rochester, and they weren't getting the money that they needed. So in 1945, they actually put up a millage, and it failed by a 2/3 margin. They wanted to put on an auditorium, a field, and build a whole new elementary school. And that was the basics. There was a whole list of things that needed to be done, and it failed. Of course, their tax base is District number 5. It's not all these other districts that are just sending their kids into school. So to them, it would be great to consolidate because they're going to get a higher tax base that they can pull in as well. When people weren't doing that because the school districts wanted that local control, because they could still choose if they wanted to, they could bring their kids back and they could run their own school. They could choose how much money they spent, choose the school bus driver. But in 1948, Rochester started telling people, you can't come unless you're actually in our district. We're full. Sorry. Go home. So unless you want to annex into our district, you are no longer welcome here because we don't have space anymore. It was a matter of space. So you start getting reports written up. They start pulling in state and federal help, trying to come up with a plan based on that 1917 agricultural laws and the 1897 law that I showed you at the very beginning. How do we bring these back? So guess what? Stony Creek actually reopened their school as an overflow. So there's no record that they were actually kicked out of the Rochester schools, but the school was here, and so they actually started having classes. So Stony Creek to reopen after 15 years, and it's going to have 35 pupils. If you've been in that schoolhouse, that'd be a very full schoolhouse down there. But it says, it reverses the trend in the recent years to close out the little red schoolhouse so famous in America. 1944, the nation said, hey, let's stop doing one room, let's move towards consolidation. There was a national report pushing people to consolidate into 1944. So it's no wonder that you start seeing this here. 1952 was the year that things started happening. Took a couple years, lots of highly debated district meetings, and you finally get consolidation starting to happen. 8 districts remained. You have Avon, Stony Creek number 1, Brooklyn, Snell, Baldwin, Klein, Brush. And then by December of 1952, you pretty much had all of Rochester Community Schools established as we know it today. And this over here, this is 1945. That was not big enough for all of the students that we had here in the community. This is just a map to show you those consolidations. At the very top are all of those one-room schoolhouses over time. You can see them. I apologize, it turned black and white when it came over to this computer. But you see the little schoolhouses and their numbers. And then these are the elementary schools that exist, and high schools, middle schools that exist today. So you see them spread out, try and be a little evenly, but where it's more condensed population, you see more schools close together. The idea that you don't have to travel far from your community. So what happened to the school after they consolidated? This is still yet to come. So maybe the next time you come out here, maybe 3 years from now when you come to a March lecture series, you might see some more on the schoolhouse. From 1935 to 2023, there's some holes. There's some loose ends. Number one being the Stony Creek Community Church. We never understood why on the map the church was next to the school and now it's labeled as the church. But we think that the church moved into the school after the kids left and were being bussed out of the school. And that would make sense why they were still mowing the lawn and paying the light bill there at least. We also have newspaper articles. This actually came from a newspaper article saying exactly where the school was, or the church was, and that is exactly where the school was. So they existed inside the schoolhouse at some point. At some point, you also had Rochester administrators in the schoolhouse, and there was kind of a tit-for-tat fun article about the administrators arguing who owned the playground outside. I tried my hardest to find you a picture of that playground. I did not. If you have it at your house, please send it our way. But my guess is the administrators did not like all the noise that the neighborhood kids were making while they were playing outside, while they were trying to do their job. So, but down here you have Miss Sarah Van Hoosen Jones, who was the director, lived right down the street, said, no, this is a community park. You're not going to kick the kids out. So we know it was a kids' playground for a little bit. And we do know that they did reopen it for school between 1948 and up to 1952-53, were some of the last classes in there. We get that history from oral histories that people have shared here with our community. So, after the 1950s, it kind of fell into disarray, falling apart, dilapidated. And in 1976, the bicentennial of the nation, you have Dr. Max Malin, who steps up and decides that this schoolhouse needs to be restored. And this gentleman is the one reason why we even have that building out here today. He's actually one of our legacy families on the panel right behind me here. Huge within the community, a philanthropist. He was actually a dentist. Retired, became a teacher, served on the board, just an all-around general good guy from everything I can read about him. And his partner in crime, Sally Mallon, also within the school system here. So once they fixed it up, school teachers started having field trips out there. They ran their own field trips at the one-room schoolhouse until 2010, when it was actually gifted to the museum.
Thank you very much for coming out here tonight. Thanks, Cathy. Appreciate it.